Have you ever heard this story? This dude named Chris McCandless goes off, his parents well-to-do, engineer father, ends up having kind of a silver spoon, goes to a really nice university, and like the day he graduates, he decides that he's getting rid of everything, and he hitchhikes his way across the entire country, ultimately ending up in Alaska where he finds a magic school bus and then dies because he accidentally poisoned himself. You guys ever hear that story? Maybe? Well, if you haven't, that's what this video is about. But the story goes that he accidentally poisoned himself because he fucked up. But I'm here to tell you that that's wrong. It's a lie, and I have the proof. He didn't make a mistake. Science failed him. In 1990, at the age of 22, after freshly graduating from college, selling all of his worldly possessions, donating everything he had to charity, and deciding to leave home to go on a journey of self-realization and adventure, Chris McCandless goes to Alaska. The person who wrote about and ultimately made this story famous is an author by the name of Jon Krakauer. This was also turned into a movie, both titled Into the Wild. Sean Penn directing the movie in 2007, starring Emile Hirsch. Now, spoiler alert to all of you watching, this story doesn't end well because Chris dies at the end. I know, it's been like 30 years, major spoilers here, too soon, sorry. But here's the thing. Like I said before, everyone says Chris died because Chris screwed up. He made a mistake and got something wrong, and the reason he died is because of that mess up. But I'm here to tell you, he did not get anything wrong, and I have proof. Oh, and hey, for those of you watching, this would be the point in time where I mentioned that everybody that watches this video, like 90+% of the people that watch this video and other videos of mine don't actually subscribe to the channel, so maybe subscribing would be awesome if you like this content, and then you could, get a message or a notification or something next time I make a video like this. But anyway, back to our story. 1990, Chris leaves home. Right? Over the 2 following years, between 1990 and 1992, Chris would travel throughout the United States, primarily via hitchhiking, which eventually found him in the great state of Alaska, where he found and lived for several months in this abandoned school bus, mysteriously nestled in the bushes and underbrush next to this riverbank, approximately 28 miles inland from the George Parks Highway off of what is called the Stampede Trail. Now, this is located inside of Denali National Park of the Alaskan wilderness. I believe the scientific term for this is called the middle of fucking nowhere. In 1992, McCandless at this point is now 24. He's lived in the bus for approximately 4 months, and in the summer of August of 1992, he passes away. His body and a note found by hunters, penned in very shaky and erratic handwriting, said, "SOS. I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless." And he looks to date it but doesn't know the date and writes the word August with a question mark. It was later estimated that Chris had been dead approximately 19 days when he was found by the hunters that found him. In Alaskan survivalist circles, and hell, any survivalist circles around, you'll sometimes hear this story getting floated. Stupid kid from the suburbs thinks he's going to survive on his own in the middle of the wilderness of Alaska with nothing but his wits, some basic tools, and a few survival guides, one of which was called The Tanana Plant Lore, an ethnobotany of the Dena'ina Indians of South Central Alaska. It was a book on flora of the area that he was to be surviving in. The story goes that Chris, living on the bus and using this plant guide, had misidentified 2 plants. One of them called the wild potato, or Hedosorum alpinum, and the other called the wild sweet pea, or Hedosorum mackenzie. The wild sweet pea contained a neurotoxin, and the wild potato did not. It was apparently safe to eat. In the movie depiction, Chris, who was played by Emile Hirsch, accidentally includes the wild sweet pea in his bag of foraged plants and consumes it, causing his digestive tract to become paralyzed, him to starve, and eventually die. There's a pretty gut-wrenching scene where he's physically and mentally agonizing over his mistake, staring at remnants of a wild sweet pea plant that he accidentally consumed, and realizes that he poisoned himself without a cure, and now too weak to travel, he's left to his fate over the agonizing days it takes him to finally pass. But this isn't what actually happened, and Jon Krakauer, the author of the book, was absolutely plagued by this. See, Jon didn't believe this is the way it went. Chris wasn't an unwise person. Chris was thorough. He pored relentlessly over this plant guide, wrote notes in his diary, and the guide itself went into painstaking detail about these 2 plants because they appeared so similar, stating care should be taken to identify them accurately before attempting to use the wild potato as food, and then went over in detail on how to tell them apart. As Chris was realizing that he had been poisoned, he wrote a diary entry that said, "Extremely weak, fault of potato seed, much trouble just to stand up, starving, great jeopardy. Now, John believed that Chris had not misidentified those plants at all, but instead that it was possible the wild potato plant itself, or part of it, was somehow poisonous. But the book, the guide, said the entire wild potato plant was completely safe to eat. It was supposedly edible. But Krakauer balked at this. He believed Chris was smarter than that. He noticed that when he visited the site where Chris had died, that there were wild potato plants everywhere. Years after the original publishing of his book, he stated he was able to harvest a pound of wild potato seeds in a Ziploc bag in mere minutes. And around the time of the first edition of the book's publishing, the first edition of Into the Wild back in 1996, John ended up sending off a bunch of wild potato plants from around the bus to be tested for different types of poison, and nothing at all was found. The person who tested it, Dr. Thomas Clausen, a professor in the biochemistry department of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, told Men's Journal, "I tore that plant apart. There were no toxins, no alkaloids. I'd eat that myself." And that interview was in 2007. So if you're following along, it's now been 13 years since Chris died, and all the while the belief was he poisoned himself by eating the wrong plant, which caused GI tract paralysis, and now there's scientific evidence eliminating the potato plant that was suspected. Hell, maybe Chris did just mess it up, I guess. Fast forward to 2013. Nearly 20 years after Chris died, a guy by the name of Ronald Hamilton posts a paper called The Silent Fire, ODAP and the Death of Christopher McCandless. Hamilton, up until this point, was a bookbinder that worked at the UPenn Library and was just a writer on the side. He said that he read Into the Wild, and it reminded him of a place called Vapniarka. Vapniarka was the name of a little-known concentration camp located in Nazi-occupied Ukraine during World War II. As part of a really messed up experiment, an officer and doctor at Vapniarka started to feed the inmates of the camp bread made from the seeds of the grass pea Lathrius sativus. Now, this plant has lore dating back to ancient Greece, and the neurotoxin contained in it goes by the name of the Silent Fire. It was called the Silent Fire because it slowly burned up the ability for the inmates that ate this bread to walk, of which at the time there was no cure. The poison would eventually render whomever ate it paralyzed. It's referred to as neurolatharism, or just latharism. A really messed up twist in this is that the officer, the doctor from this camp that poisoned all of these men, was one of the people that survived the war. He ended up fleeing Nazi Germany and relocated to Israel, studying the disease he had caused and researching treatment for the people he ended up paralyzing. So part of the reason why we have treatments that we do is the guy that caused it also became the cure. Kind of messed up. This amino acid neurotoxin of the grass pea was finally identified some 20 years after World War II in 1964 and given a very long and very scientific name that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, shortened to simply ODAP, or ODAP. For whatever reason, it works by overstimulating nerve receptors on the legs and then burns them out. But there's an interesting twist to this particular toxin. See, it doesn't affect everyone the same way. Different age groups and genders, ethnicities all react more slowly or quickly or more or less severe. But the one thing that is true across all of them is that it never improves. It only ever gets worse, and for some reason it only ever really affects the legs and slowly paralyzes them over time, sometimes very rapidly, within hours, overnight. So if it's to be believed that Chris didn't eat the wrong thing, he didn't eat the wild sweet pea, but he ate the right stuff, the wild potato, could it be that the wild potato had this amino acid in it? And the bigger question is, there's been tons of field guides talking about how the wild potato is edible, and none of this had ever been heard of in the past. No one eating wild potato had ever had this happen to them. If it was poisonous, how come it wasn't identified until Chris? Dr. Fernand Lambine, a scientist with the Cyanide Diseases and Neurolatharism Network, states that occasional consumption of foods that contain ODAP doesn't bear any risk of toxicity if eaten as part of an otherwise balanced diet. But individuals suffering from malnutrition, stress, and acute hunger are especially sensitive to ODAP, and while different age groups, etc., react to it differently, the hardest hit by ODAP poisoning are young men between the ages of 15 and 25. Chris was 24, malnourished, stressed out of his mind, and very hungry. He was the perfect storm for ODAP poisoning. Krakauer sent 150 grams of those seeds to Avamine Analytical Services in Ann Arbor, Michigan for a specific test called high-pressure liquid chromatography, which was performed by a guy named Dr. Craig Larner, who found a concentration of 0.394% by volume of ODAP, more than enough to poison a human being. Chris did poison himself, I want to make that very clear, but it was not because he misidentified the plant. Chris was poisoned by a toxin that caused him to rapidly become paralyzed and unable to forage for food because the guidebook that he used in all science-backed information at the time were wholly unaware that the plant that was deemed safe to consume had toxic seeds that ultimately caused Chris's death. Chris was not inept, and Chris did not make a mistake. In this case, Chris did everything by the book, and the book killed him. It took nearly 20 years for Chris to be vindicated, and as Krakauer writes, had McCandless's guidebook to edible plants warned that wild potato seeds contained a neurotoxin that can cause paralysis, he probably would have walked out of the wild in late August with no more difficulty than when he walked into the wild in April, and would still be alive today. If that were the case, Chris McCandless, at the point in time of this article's publishing, would now be 45 years old. And to add to that, at the point in time of this YouTube video having been made, Chris would be 57. So yeah, spread this story around. And if you hear anybody talking about Chris McCandless or the story of Into the Wild, now you know the truth.